The sparks landed on Nora Callahan's arm and she did not flinch. She had been at the forge for 11 hours, and her arms had stopped sending complaints to her brain around hour 6. The metal in front of her was still wrong. She knew it. She could feel the grain in it, the way a blacksmith feels a flaw before she sees one, some old human instinct that her alien classmates would never understand and her alien professor had already dismissed. Decorative, Professor Kale had said 3 days ago when he handed out the assignment. His voice had the kind of tone that made everything it touched feel smaller. The sword is a symbol. You will craft one. The quality of the symbol is what will be judged. Structural integrity is secondary. Artistry is primary. He had looked at the human students when he said that last part. There were 4 of them in the class: Nora, Owen Blake, Claire Ford, and a quiet boy named Pete Granger who rarely spoke. Kale's eyes moved across them, the way someone moves across a page they have already decided is not worth reading. Nora had written down his instructions. Then she had written down her own. The Interstellar Academy of Craft Sciences sat on a station that orbited a cold blue star, and it accepted students from 42 known species. The course Professor Kale taught was called Material History and Symbolic Fabrication. Most students took it because it was easy. Most alien students, anyway. For them, crafting a decorative blade was no different from painting a portrait or weaving a ceremonial cloth. It was art. It was symbol. The blade did not need to cut anything. It needed to look like it could. Humans had a different relationship with swords. Nora had grown up in a small town in northern England, in a house where her grandmother kept a framed print of a 13th century sword above the kitchen fireplace. Her grandmother had been a historical reenactor and later a blacksmith, and she had taught Nora to work metal before Nora was 10 years old. Not art metal, working metal. Metal that held an edge, metal that took a strike, metal that did not give when given a reason to give. When Nora applied to the academy, the intake examiner had looked at her application with something between confusion and mild amusement. "You listed blacksmithing as a primary skill," the examiner had said. "Is that common for humans?" "It used to be," Nora had said. She had gotten in, and she had quickly learned that being human at the academy meant being a curiosity. The other species were polite, mostly. Some were genuinely warm. But there was a particular kind of politeness that sits just on top of doubt, and she had felt that most from Professor Kale, who ran his class as though humans were guests at a table that was not built for them. His first lecture, he had explained that material culture reflected the intellectual and spiritual development of a species. He had shown examples from across the galaxy: Verath crystal weave, Doran bone carving, Sali light forming. He had not shown a single human example. When Owen Blake raised his hand and asked about Damascus steel, Kale had paused, looked at Owen, and said, "Primitive metallurgy. We will not be going backward." Owen had put his hand down. The assignment was due in 8 days. Students were permitted to use any material they could source from the station's supply bay. They were permitted to use any tools in the fabrication wing. They were evaluated on beauty, originality, and cultural authenticity. Nora had gone to the supply bay the first day and spent 4 hours going through every metal stock they had. She had found something close to high-carbon iron, not identical but workable, and she had found a clay-based compound that, when mixed with the station's thermal stabilizer, behaved very much like the refractory clay her grandmother used for differential hardening. She had not told Kale what she was planning. She had not told most of her classmates either. Owen knew because Owen had looked over her shoulder at her notes and said, "You're actually making it functional, aren't you?" "Yes," she said. "He's going to fail you," Owen said. "He might," she said. She turned back to the forge. The station's fabrication wing closed at midnight station time, but Nora had filed for an extended hours permit on day 1. She worked in the early morning when the wing was empty, and the only sound was the hiss of the thermal regulator and the ring of hammer on metal. She was making a sword that could cut. She was making a sword that could hold its edge through 300 strikes. She was making a sword that, if you tested it against Kale's grading rubric, would score poorly on artistry and somewhere between average and good on originality. But it would be real. She did not know yet what she was going to do with real. She pulled the blade from the coals, watched the color run from white to orange to the exact shade she wanted, and set it to the horn of the anvil. The hammer came down clean and true. The station hummed around her. Cold blue starlight came in through the small viewport above the quench tank. She worked. Outside in the corridor beyond the fabrication wing, Professor Kale was making his nightly round of the student workshops. He stopped at the window of the forge where the light from inside fell in a long orange strip across the hall floor. He looked in. He watched for a moment. He saw the human girl at the anvil, alone, working a blade by hand, working it the old way. He noted it in his log as traditional affectation. He moved on. Inside, Nora heard nothing. She was listening to the metal. By day 4, the blade had a shape. It was not the shape of anything Nora had copied from a reference image. It was the shape that the steel had wanted, which sounded like something a fool would say, but any blacksmith would understand it. You worked with what the metal gave you, and you guided it toward what it needed to be. The steel Nora had sourced from the supply bay had a particular grain, a little coarser than ideal, and so the blade had come out slightly wider at the base than she had originally intended, with a fuller that ran longer than planned. She had considered fighting it. She had decided not to. Owen came by on day 4 to watch for an hour. He sat on a stool near the door with a container of station coffee, which tasted like hot cardboard, and he did not say much. That was one of the things Nora liked about Owen. He understood when watching was enough. "The grain's visible," he said eventually, "on the flat." "I know," she said. "It looks good." "It is good, it's not perfect. Nobody's going to see that but you." She looked up from the blade. "Kale will." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know he's already decided what mark he's giving you." "Probably. So why are you still going?" She turned the blade in the light of the forge, watching the grain run under the surface of the steel, alive under the flat face of the metal. "Because the blade doesn't know that," she said. Owen nodded and drank his coffee. Across the fabrication wing in the other booths, she could see her classmates working. The Verath student Myra was 3 stations down. Myra was working with crystal silk, spinning it into patterns that caught the light and threw color across the ceiling. It was beautiful. Genuinely, honestly beautiful, the kind of beautiful that Nora could appreciate fully and still know was not the thing she was making. Myra had been kind to Nora since the first week. She had also, twice, quietly suggested that Nora might want to switch her project toward something more aesthetic. Nora had thanked her both times. Drex, the Doran student who sat 2 seats from her in lecture, had not been kind. Drex was crafting a ceremonial hunting blade from his species' traditional bone material, and it was coming along impressively, a curved thing with inlaid shellwork along the spine. On day 2, Drex had walked past Nora's station, looked at her blade blank, looked at Nora and said, "Is that a joke or is that your project?" "It's my project," she said. "It looks like something a child dug out of the ground," he said. "Not yet," she said. He had laughed and walked away. The differential hardening was the part she had been most worried about. The station's quench fluids were not water and they were not the oil her grandmother had used, and she had spent 2 days on scrap pieces testing the temperature curves, adjusting ratios, recording results in a notebook she wrote in English because she thought in English when she was working. She had gotten it close enough by day 3. On day 4, she did the first full quench on the actual blade. It held. She ran a file across the edge to check. The file skipped. The edge had taken the hardening correctly, the surface harder than the core, the spine tough enough not to break, an edge that was hard enough to cut, and a body that was strong enough to stay whole. She ran a second check, then a third. It held every time. She allowed herself briefly to feel something close to satisfaction, not pride. Satisfaction was different. Satisfaction was the feeling of a thing done correctly according to the rules of the thing itself, not the rules of a rubric. She started on the handle the next morning. She had found a dense composite wood in the supply bay, a material the station used for structural panels, and she had cut it to blocks and shaped it to fit her grip. Not the grip of an idealized hand, her grip. The wrap was a fiber she had sourced from the textile section, not traditional leather, not anything she would have used on Earth, but it had the right friction and the right thickness, and she wound it the way her grandmother had shown her, tight figure-8 passes, never overlapping the same angle twice. Professor Kale came through the fabrication wing on day 5 for a progress inspection. He stopped at Drex's station first and spent several minutes. He spoke about the shell inlay. He praised the curvature of the blade. He asked questions about cultural reference points. He smiled, which was something his face did rarely. He moved to Myra's station and praised the crystal silk work with something approaching admiration. He moved to 3 other stations. He reached Nora's station. He looked at the blade where it sat on her workbench. He looked at the handle half-wrapped. He looked at Nora. "This is your project," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "You are attempting a functional blade." "I've made one," she said. Kale picked up the blade without asking. He held it flat in both hands and looked down the length of it. The grain of the steel was visible. The fuller was longer than strict symmetry would have demanded. The geometry of the edge was not decorative. It was a working bevel, ground at the angle that held an edge under impact. "This scores very poorly on artistry," Kale said. "I know," she said. "The handle work is competent. The proportions are reasonable, but this is not what the assignment calls for. This is not a symbolic object. This is a tool." "The assignment called for a sword," she said. "I made a sword." Kale set it down. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not fully read. He looked at her the way he had looked at Owen on the first day of class. "We will discuss your grade at evaluation," he said. He moved to the next station. Nora picked up her blade. She checked the edge again with her thumbnail, running it across the flat at an angle, feeling the bite. The edge was true. She went back to work. Evaluation day arrived with a particular kind of quiet. The fabrication wing had been cleared of all working materials. The stations were clean. The 12 students in the course stood in a loose line with their finished pieces on the workbench in front of them. Nora stood near the end of the line, her sword wrapped in a plain cloth, unceremonious. 3 evaluators had come from the Academy's review board to observe. One was an older Verath scholar. One was a Solly professor from the design faculty. The third was Dean Harlow, the Academy's human administrator, who had been at the station for 6 years, and who had the manner of a person who had attended many evaluations and knew how they usually went. Kale stood at the front of the room and explained the evaluation criteria in a tone that left little doubt about what he considered excellent. He began at the far end of the line. The first student, a young Solly named Vel, had created something that was less a sword and more a conversation. The blade was formed from compressed light, held in a crystalline sheath that could be dissolved or reformed. When Vel lifted it, the color shifted with her mood. When she set it down, it went cool and blue. The Verath scholar leaned forward with great interest. Even Nora found herself watching. The second student had gone the opposite direction. A Doran named Rek who had carved a ceremonial blade from a single piece of petrified bone. Every millimeter of the surface was covered in micro-engravings. Kale examined it for 3 minutes without speaking, which was the highest praise he offered. Drex came next. His curved blade caught every light in the room and threw it back out in fractured pieces. The shell inlay caught reflections from angles that seemed physically improbable. The board murmured. Kale called it a demonstration of material intuition. Drex looked at Nora as he stepped back into line. She looked back at him. Myra's crystal silk blade drew a sound from the room when she unveiled it. The piece moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but slightly, the way a living thing breathes. Myra had woven motion into the structure of the material itself. It was the most technically impressive piece Nora had seen outside of a museum. She recognized it as such. She also recognized that if you tried to use it, it would shatter on the first contact with anything harder than air. The evaluations moved down the line. Owen had made something clever, a blade with a handle that could be unscrewed and reversed, making it function as a writing instrument at one end and a symbolic sword at the other. He had framed it as a comment on human cultural transition. Dean Harlow smiled at it. Kale said, "Interesting concept. Execution is moderate." Owen shrugged slightly as he stepped back. Claire had made a blade from a reflective alloy so polished that it showed the viewer's own face back at them in a distorted form. She had titled it, in her brief presentation, "A sword that shows the enemy what it is fighting." Kale gave it a brief nod. Pete's blade was simple and quiet, a carved wood piece with no edge and no pretense. He had said during his presentation that he was making a statement about the ceremony of conflict, the idea of a weapon as theater. Kale had not visibly reacted to it. Then Kale reached Nora. She unwrapped the blade from the cloth. The room did not make a sound, not the warm sound it had made for Myra's piece, not the interested sound it had made for Vel's, just quiet. The sword was not spectacular in appearance. The steel had a visible grain that ran from the base of the blade to the tip, subtle but present. The fuller was clean. The edge was ground to a working bevel that caught the overhead light in a narrow line. The handle was wrapped in tight, even passes of dark fiber. There were no inlays. There was no color. There was no motion. Kale looked at it for a long moment. "This is the same piece you showed me during inspection," he said. "Yes," she said. "You made no changes." "I finished the handle," she said. "The blade was done." He picked it up. This time he held it differently than he had during inspection. He held it by the handle. He turned it slowly. He looked down the spine. He looked at the edge. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, something small and specific. "The edge geometry is agricultural," he said. Nora knew what he meant. In Kale's framework, agricultural meant functional, and functional meant primitive, and primitive meant low. It was a precise word choice designed to say several things at once while being technically unchallengeable. She let him say it. "The handle is serviceable," he continued. "The proportions are historically derivative. This is not original work. It is a reproduction of a primitive human cutting tool. I am prepared to award a passing grade on the basis of craftsmanship alone, but the symbolic content of this piece is minimal. You have made a blade. You have not made meaning." He set it back on the workbench. The Vereth scholar looked at the sword. The Sali professor looked at Nora. Dean Harlow had not moved since Kale began speaking. Nora looked at her sword. Then she said quietly but clearly, "May I demonstrate it?" Kale paused. "That is not part of the evaluation." "The evaluation criteria include structural integrity," she said. "None of the other pieces have been tested for that. If the criterion is present in the rubric, I am entitled to demonstrate it." Kale looked at Dean Harlow. Harlow said carefully, "She is correct about the rubric." The room had gone very still. Kale considered the request for 4 seconds. 4 was a long time for a man who made fast decisions. He reached below the evaluator's table and retrieved a standard testing block, a dense polymer cube used in structural assessments of student fabrications. Every student knew about it. The block had a compression rating that placed it above the threshold for most decorative blade work. It was not designed to be a fair test for a working edge. It was designed to be the last word. He set it on the workbench. "You may demonstrate," he said. The room rearranged itself without anyone deciding to rearrange it. The 12 students stepped back. The 3 evaluators positioned themselves at a better angle. Drex crossed his arms. Myra watched Nora with an expression that was equal parts anticipation and worry. Owen, from 2 spots down the line, said nothing. He had gone very still. Nora picked up her sword. She had held a sword before, obviously, her grandmother's reproduction pieces, training blades at reenactment events she had attended as a teenager, and once, in a museum in York, a sword from the 13th century that a curator had let her hold for 30 seconds with both hands gloved. This was different from all of those. This was something she had made, and that changed the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was correct and well-balanced, but the other kind of weight. The kind that does not register on a scale. She set her feet. She positioned her hands the way her grandmother had taught her, left hand at the base of the handle, right hand at the shoulder, the small adjustments that moved the blade's geometry from carry to use. She oriented to the block. She struck. The sound was not what most of the room expected. Most of them expected a thud, or a crack, or a failed impact. What they got was a clean, single note, hard and brief, and the block split from the top surface to the base in a line so straight it might have been drawn with a tool. The room stayed silent. The 2 halves of the block rested on the workbench. Nora lowered the blade. The edge had not chipped. It had not bent. There was a faint smear of polymer dust along the lower third of the edge. The blade itself was unchanged. Kale looked at the block. The Varath scholar stood up from her seat and walked closer. She picked up one of the halves and examined the cut surface. Her expression was careful and unreadable in the way that careful people make their expressions when they are updating a belief they held with confidence. "The cut is clean," the scholar said. It was a quiet observation, not a compliment, but it was accurate. The Solly professor had not moved, but he was watching Nora with a different quality of attention than he had given any of the other pieces. Dean Harlow said nothing. Kale set the block pieces down. He looked at Nora. He looked at the sword. He looked at Nora again. "The demonstration proves structural competence," he said. "It does not alter my evaluation of the symbolic content." "Then may I ask a question?" Nora said. "You may. What is the symbolic content of a sword that cannot cut?" The room did not react outwardly, but the quality of the silence changed. There is a kind of silence that comes before an answer, and a kind that comes when an answer has already been given, and the room is deciding what to do with it. This was the second kind. Kale said, "A sword's symbolic meaning does not require function. The symbol stands independent of the tool." "Across most cultures in the galaxy, yes," Nora said. "But the assignment was a sword, not a symbol of a sword, not a representation of a sword, a sword. Across most human cultures, the sword's symbolic meaning comes directly from its function. A blade that cannot cut has no authority. A blade that can cut, that someone made correctly from the right material, with the right geometry, with the knowledge of what a sword is for, that blade carries meaning every time it is held. The meaning is in the making." Kale was quiet. The Varath scholar had set down the block half. She was looking at Nora. "You are arguing," Kale said slowly, "that functional authenticity is a form of symbolic content." "I am arguing that for humans, it is the primary form," she said. Kale looked at the blade on the workbench. He looked at the clean line that ran through the center of the polymer block. He looked at the evaluators. The Varath scholar had returned to her seat. The Solly professor had his hands folded. Dean Harlow was watching Kale. "Your grade will be reconsidered," Kale said. It was not a concession. It was not praise, but it was a door that had been closed and was now slightly open. Nora wrapped her sword back in the cloth. Owen released a breath he had been holding for approximately 3 minutes. Drex was no longer looking at her. Myra had a small expression at the corner of her face that might have been a smile. The evaluation continued. But the room was different. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would read in an official report or a course transcript. But the evaluators who left the fabrication wing that afternoon left it having seen something they had not been scheduled to see. And the Verath scholar, who had published 42 papers on material culture, rode the transit corridor back to her office, turning a specific idea over in her mind. The idea that meaning and function might not be two separate things, but one thing viewed from different ends. The grades posted 3 days later. Nora scored the highest mark in the course. She read the notification 3 times before she believed it, and then a 4th time because belief and certainty are different things, and she had learned to check her certainty. The comments from the evaluation board were brief. The Verath scholar had written 2 sentences. Demonstrates complete command of material, process, and cultural context. A rigorous piece of original scholarship executed in metal. Kale's comments were not included in the student-facing report. She found out later from Dean Harlow what they had said. Harlow did not share the exact wording. He shared only this. He did not contest the board's decision. That, she understood, was its own kind of statement. Owen had scored a merit grade which he accepted with good humor and a shrug. I made a pen with a sword attached, he said. I should be grateful it passed. It was clever, she said. Clever is the B of intellectual achievement, he said. You made the real thing. The weeks that followed were interesting in ways she had not anticipated. The Verath scholar, Professor Adren Lev, sent her a message requesting a meeting. Lev was one of the most senior academics on the station, a person whose opinions shaped syllabi across 4 departments. Nora met her in a small office near the observatory deck, where a long window showed the cold blue star hanging in silence. Lev asked her about her grandmother. Not about the sword, not immediately. About her grandmother. About the transmission of skill, the way hands teach hands, the way a woman in a northern English town could put knowledge in her granddaughter's grip that would travel 40 light years and cut a polymer block in half in front of a room full of people who had never seen a working blade. Nora talked for a long time. Lev listened the way scholars listen, when they are not performing interest, but actually feeling it. At the end of the meeting, Lev said she was proposing an addition to the material history curriculum, a unit on Earth metallurgical traditions, to be developed in consultation with human faculty members and students with relevant expertise. She said it carefully, without drama, as though it were a small administrative matter. Nora understood that it was not small. She said she would be glad to contribute. She went back to her dormitory and sat on the edge of her bed and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the sword, not the evaluation, not the grade, but the chain of it. Her grandmother at the forge in northern England, teaching a 10-year-old how to listen to metal. Her grandmother's grandmother who had learned from someone else, another set of hands, another fire. The long, unbroken line of human people who had understood that a thing you make with knowledge and care, and the right understanding of what the material is, and what it is for, that thing carries truth in a way that a beautiful symbol cannot. She thought about Kale. She did not feel triumph about Kale. What she felt was harder to name. She had not wanted to humiliate him. She had wanted to be correct, and she had been correct, and being correct had required the sword to be real, and the sword being real had required Kale to be wrong, and that was simply the shape of how it had gone. You do not resent a wall for being in the place you need to walk through. You either find a door or you demonstrate that the wall is not as solid as it claimed to be. Kale found her 3 weeks after the evaluation in the corridor outside the library. He stopped walking when he reached her. She stopped too. He said, "Your grandmother was a blacksmith." "Yes," she said. "Did she know she was teaching you something that would matter 40 light years from home?" Nora thought about it. She thought about her grandmother standing at the anvil at 6 in the morning with strong tea on the windowsill and old music playing from a small speaker on the shelf, correcting Nora's grip without a word, just moving her hands to the right position and stepping back. I think she knew, Nora said. She just didn't know where. Kale was quiet for a moment. He was not a warm person. He had not suddenly become one. But there was something in him that had shifted, something that was still moving and had not yet settled. I will be adjusting the assignment criteria next year, he said. He walked away. She watched him go. Owen appeared from around the corner with 2 containers of station coffee, the bad kind, because the good kind cost an amount that was unjustifiable on a student budget. Was that Kale? He said. Yes, she said. What did he want? She took one of the coffees. She turned it in her hands. It was warm and terrible, and she was grateful for it. To tell me something he couldn't say in front of an audience, she said. Owen considered this. Was it a good something? She thought about the assignment criteria being changed. She thought about Lev's curriculum proposal. She thought about the clean line that ran through the polymer block, straight and true as a sentence her grandmother had once said to her. A thing made well enough speaks for itself. Yes, she said, I think it was. They walked back down the corridor together. The cold blue star was visible beyond the viewport at the end of the hall, the same one it had been when she first arrived, the same one she had looked at through the quench tank window during those long early mornings in the forge. It did not look different. Nothing had to look different for something to have changed. The sword was in her dormitory, still wrapped in the plain cloth. She had been asked, twice now, whether she would donate it to the Academy's Material Culture Archive. She had said she needed to think about it. She was still thinking. Some things you make to prove a point. Some things you make to leave behind. And some things you make because the making of them is itself the whole answer to a question that was never politely asked. A question about what humans know, what humans carry, what humans bring with them when they travel 40 light-years from a small town in northern England to a station orbiting a cold blue star. The answer was this. All of this,